Yo guys, Paunchy here, and today we're going to learn about trig conditions on our Analog Rytm MK2. Let's go! Alright guys, so I have a beat pulled up here. This is what it sounds like. Okay, now let's go through each one of the trig conditions one by one, and then in another video I'll be going over some ways to make this stuff more musical. But let's just go through each of the settings. So if you look on my bass drum track here, I have 5 trigs laid out. None of them have any conditions on them. So if you look in the top right of the trig menu, you'll see a PRB setting, and that's a probability setting. So if we set this, right now it's at 100%, if we set this to 50% and you play it, let me mute the other tracks here. So if you play it, you'll notice that not every trig triggers every time. That's because across the board, every trig has a 50% probability to actually trig. So that's trig conditions in a nutshell. They're used to, instead of, to make things more musical, more human, dare I say, because it makes it so it's not the same every single time. You know, that was the big thing with drum machines and sequencers, you know, from the get-go, is they sound so robotic because they play the exact same thing every time. So somewhere along the way, trig conditions came in order for us to inject a little bit of humanity into our drum machines. So that's them in a nutshell, but we're going to go over the other ones because there are other trig conditions that you can use on a per step basis, per trig basis. So let's go ahead and hold these 2 down here. You can hold one, you can hold all of them, as many fingers as you have. But for this purpose, I'm going to hold these 2 to show how they can both be edited at the same time. So once you hold these down, you'll notice it goes to TRC, which is of course for trig conditions. If we turn the knob, the D encoder, to the left, you'll see that we have the probability that we just talked about. But if you go to the right past 100, you'll have all these other trig conditions that are extremely useful. So first one after 100 is fill. So on the right, the bottom right of your Analog Rytm, you have a fill button here. So these fill conditions, if you have trig set to fill, they'll only play when you're holding down the fill button. So now that we have these 2 trigs set to fill, let's play the pattern. You'll notice they do not trig at all. But if we hold down the fill button, they play every single time, indefinitely, until you let go of the fill button. So there's another interesting way to use the fill button. Say you want the fill trigs to trigger just on the next repetition, then you would hold function and press fill, and you'll see that it's queued up red. So what that means is that the next time the pattern plays, it will play those fill trigs, but then every time after that it'll go back to the way it was and they won't be played. So let's press play and see what happens. You'll see the red went away, and now these trigs are no longer trigging because they are fill trigs. So if we hold down fill, they'll trig. Okay? And there's a third way to use the fill button. If you hold function and press fill twice, you'll see that it turns white. That essentially is like a hard fill mode. So that means that every single time the pattern plays from now on, it will play the fill trigs every single time. So let's press play. So you'll see that they do indeed trig every single time. Also, one thing I should have mentioned, of course, I hope it goes without saying, you're gonna need a beat for this. I just made one up, you know, before I started making this video. And for simplicity's sake, in my opinion, trigs are most powerful when the patterns are set to 16, to 1 page or 1 bar, however you want to look at it. You know, you can also do advanced mode if you want. We won't be going over that in this video. You can see that kind of stuff in my other videos. But for now, I'm just going to make it so it's in normal mode and every pattern is 16 steps. Again, trig conditions are most powerful when you're using less pages or less steps, because it allows you to get more bang for your buck, so to speak, out of each pattern, out of each page. So I recommend starting in 16 step mode. But anyway, moving on. So fill with the line over it. All the ones with the line over it essentially mean the exact opposite of the one before it. So fill with the line over it will perform the opposite way. So the way to turn off hard fill mode, by the way, is just press it so it's no longer white anymore. So now these will trig every time when fill is not pressed, because they are fill with the line over it, which is the opposite. So you can see that every single time they play, then if you hold fill, as long as you're holding fill, or if it's in hard fill mode, the fill trigs will not play. So again, the exact opposite of what we were doing before. That's really nice. If you to use the line, the fill, the opposite fill mode, whatever you want to call it, no fill, that would be really great for breakdowns. You know, if you have a really busy beat and you want to set a bunch of your trigs to no fill, then that would be great for breakdowns, because you're essentially removing all these trigs on the fly without having to actually remove the trigs. So, you know, the trig conditions are really good for playing live, and fill especially is really good for playing live. So, okay, so now we're gonna stay on the bass drum here. Now, if we go to the next one, we have pre. So what pre does, I'm gonna set 1 and 4 back to the way they were, just remove them and add them back. What pre does is it looks at the active trig before that trig. So if we use pre on 9, what we're gonna have to do, basically all that pre means is if the last trig plays, then the pre trig will play. So being as 7 is at 100%, 9 is gonna trig every single time. So what we want to do is use it with some of the probability. So let's use it with, say, 50%, for example. So this is set to 50%, this is set to pre. So every time that this one trigs, 9 will also trig. And as with any probability, anyone who's ever been on a slot machine or anything like that, you know that just because it's 50%, which is technically half the time, doesn't mean that it's going to trigger every other time, for example. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So pre-trigs are really useful for that reason. So I'm not going to go into it, but pre with the line, of course, is the exact opposite of what it was before. So if this one does trig, then this one won't. 9 is not going to trig if 7 does, and 9 will trig if 7 does not trig. I know that gets a little confusing, but that's how it goes. So I'm going to reset these. So the next one after pre is neighbor. So for some reason when I started using Elektron gear, I thought that was neither, or neither, however you say it. But yeah, turns out it's neighbor. So what that means is it's essentially just like the pre-trig condition. However, instead of looking at the trig directly before it, it's looking at the neighbor track. So the neighbor track is defined as the track before the current track that you're working on. So being as there's no track before here, let's move to 2. So what we're going to do here is set a snare to neighbor, and then we're going to go back over here and set the same step on the bass track, the bass drum track, to 50%. Okay, so now what I expect to happen is this snare will trig every time this bass drum trigs, and you'll hear it because those are the only steps in the whole page, the whole pattern, that where there's a snare and a bass drum on the same step. So let's hear what that sounds like. Okay, didn't trig, didn't trig, didn't trig. Bam, that one did trig. But first, of course, we're going to have to unmute our snare drum. Okay. Bam. So you could hear there was a couple times there where the kick and the snare, the bass drum and the snare trigged at the exact same time because, again, this is a neighbor track on the snare, and this one's set to 50%. So every time this bass drum one trigs, the snare one also trigs. So that's another really interesting one. You know, that's infinitely useful for beats. You know, there's so many different ways you can use that. So moving forward, neighbor with the line over it is the exact opposite of neighbor without the line. So I won't go over that, but essentially if the kick drum one triggers, the snare drum will not, and vice versa. So, and then finally what we have here are more trig conditions that look like ratios, but they are not exactly the same as the probability. So if we go to 1 to 2, for example, well, let's go to 1 to 4 because that's a better example. So what 1 to 4 means is that for every 4 repetitions of the pattern, the entire pattern, it will only trigger the first time. Okay? So if we move it to 2 to 4, for every 4 repetitions, and in this case, again, our patterns are only 16 steps. So for every 4 times that this pattern plays, this one will only trigger the second time around. So 2 to 4 does not mean 50% of the time like the probability does. That only means that you have 4 distinct repetitions and only the second one will trig. The first, the third, and the fourth, it will not trig. So that's really useful. The one I like to use a lot is 4 to 4. So all that means is that this trig will only trigger every 4 repetitions. That's another way to look at it. Well, it depends how you want to look at it. Everyone visualizes things differently, because 3 to 4 does not mean every 3 times it will trig. It just means that on the 3rd repetition, for every 4, it will trig. So that one can be a little confusing, but once you learn how to use that, once you start incorporating that into your beats, oh, it's amazing. So for example, 1 to 7, for every 7 repetitions of the pattern, it will only trigger on the first time. And then likewise for 2 to 7, for every 7 repetitions, this trig will only trigger on the second one. So I'll show you, let's do the 2 to 4 one. That's the second time. Here's the third time, fourth time, back to the first time, second, third, fourth. So you can hear that it's only triggering on the second repetition. So, hope that helps you guys. I'll do another video where I go over the trig conditions in a more musical manner, in a way that I show you some different ways that I use them. So, again, if that helped you, leave a like down below. Leave a comment if you have any questions or any requests for anything involving trig conditions, like another video. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, ring the bell. Otherwise, I release videos every week, so you can look forward to those every week. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.